Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today we're going to be looking at this, the CUT-50P plasma cutter from Vevor. So today we're going to be looking at this Vevor model plasma cutter. If you're not familiar with plasma cutters, they use a jet of hot plasma to cut metal. Yeah, that's kind of it. Anyway, we'll be evaluating it from the perspective of a knife maker. So first, we'll talk about how well it works, and second, we'll evaluate, is this something that you as a knife maker would have any use for? The Vevor CUT-50P is the pilot arc version of the cheaper CUT-50, which means you have to tap it and establish an arc, but this one you don't. The CUT-50P sells for about $200 on the Vevor website, making it extremely cheap. So, is it worth it? We'll find out. And just so you know, Vevor did not pay me for this video, but they did send me the machine for free, so take all of that for whatever it's worth. Now, I've been kind of idly interested in plasma cutters for a long time, but I never really had occasion to do anything with them. They're not that commonly used by knife makers. I'll get into why that is in a minute, but first, let's talk about the machine.
This is a 50-watt plasma cutter. It cuts most metals, steel, aluminum, copper, whatever. The whole unit weighs 22 pounds and has a 16-foot line for the cutter handpiece. It can run on 110 or 220. I ran it only on 220 for reasons I'll explain later, but my guess is you'll get way better performance out of it if you run it that way. Air is key to understanding plasma cutters. Plasma, often referred to as the fourth state of matter, solid, liquid, gas, plus plasma, is basically a gas where the component atoms are so hot that their electrons just go flying all over the place. It's ionized, in other words. In addition to being crazy hot, like 20,000 degrees or something, all those electrons flying around make the plasma super reactive. So basically the iron atoms, or whatever you're cutting, react really, really aggressively. There's a ton of heat, it melts, and the jet of gas blows all the molten metal out the bottom of the hole. So to work, the plasma cutter needs a compressed air source. This does not come with the machine. You got to have it yourself. In this case, they recommend using at least 6 cubic feet per minute when running at least 4.5 pounds of pressure to maintain cutting for long cuts. This means you need a pretty good sized compressor, at least for sustained work. So the Vevor arrives more or less unassembled. You've got your main unit plus your air hose, regulators, spare tips, other necessary hardware, the handpiece, the clamp, and all of it just screws together.
Well, in theory. In fact, the regulator and the gauge didn't fit worth crap. The threads for the gauge just weren't cut right, or maybe it was the threads on the regulator. Anyway, the point is that despite using heroic amounts of Teflon tape, I even used silicone caulk, I never could get it to stop bleeding just colossal amounts of air. So, had to go down to Home Depot, fork out about $50 for more hose clamps, more barb fittings, and a regulator to make the thing work. That's not cool. Also, if your air is not dryer, the air coming from your compressor doesn't have an inline dryer, you need an air dryer too. Also, the hose and barb fittings are metric, I think. What this meant is that the 1/4-inch hose that I had to buy at Home Depot to fit my American regulator didn't play nice with the final link in the chain, which is this little air fitting in the rear of the unit. So that meant that I had to use a heat gun to soften up the incorrectly sized hose so it would actually fit over this, I presume, metric fitting. It's not a 1/8, it's not a 3/8. Also, I had to buy a different plug because the one on here didn't fit any of the 220 outlets in my shop. That's another $10. There's also a 110 converter connection. The reason I didn't test this aspect of the machine is that once I'd changed the 220 plug, the converter didn't fit. Ultimately, I probably went to Home Depot like 5 times before I got all this stuff sorted out. That means if I'd bought this for myself, I'd had to kick in 25% more money to make the thing actually function as it's supposed to. Again, that's not cool. Now, I guess you could make the counter argument that thing's super cheap to begin with, so, kind of what'd you expect?
Anyway, I did finally get it going. And guess what? The thing actually works. Full disclosure, I know diddly squat about how to operate plasma cutters. Obviously, I watched a bunch of YouTube videos and all that, but at a certain point, you just got to turn it on and start making sparks. The amperage is adjustable, so you have to try different amperages and then also work on how fast to feed in any given combination of material thickness and amperage. That's just sort of the little game with these things, apparently. It really didn't take all that long to get reasonably dialed in, though. Bottom line, the thing cuts metal. Typical knife steel thicknesses just cut like butter. Supposedly it'll cut up to 1/2 inch stock, but honestly I didn't try that. It worked fine at 3/8 though.
So let me turn to the possible knife making applications. These days it's popular to use water jets or CNC lasers to cut knife blanks for sort of semi-production knives. Now these are expensive, complex machines. They're designed for producing really high part volumes, and so the average knife maker, it doesn't make any sense for them to run out and buy one. So the question is there any value in using a plasma cutter for cutting knife blanks to somehow get somewhere between grinding every single blade on your belt grinder and farming them out to somebody that has a water jet or a laser? Well, how exactly would that work? Perfect world, you buy a big old honking piece of steel sheet, whatever your favorite steel is, and then you cut out a whole bunch of blanks, and by doing that, you're saving yourself hours and hours of grinding. Maybe you're getting your steel a little bit cheaper, and you're saving yourself the expense of all those belts that you've been hogging off all this material with. Okay, so the theory sounds great.
But the truth is, this is a pretty tough hill to climb. Let's talk about why. Plasma is ridiculously hot. The result is there's some margin of material that's going to be decarburized, overheated, just generally ruined for use in making a knife. There's also some kerf for material removal, just like a saw, and a certain amount of bevel, in other words, the cut slants in thicker material. So you automatically lose some steel to all that. Secondarily, there's a heated zone. See the blue right here? Now that blue doesn't indicate that it's ruined for knife making, but if you were cutting already heat treated steel, that material would also have to go because it's lost its temper. Of course, most knife makers don't do it that way, but some do. Finally, no matter how good you are with the cutter, and I am not at all, obviously, you'll produce a certain amount of dross or melted waste that sticks to the underside of your stock. Once you get pretty good at this, apparently you can minimize that, but I created a fair amount of it. Anyway, bottom line, even if you can cut absolutely perfectly, more on that in a second, you still have to account for all this waste and crud and grind down to usable metal. So let's try. I'm just going to draw a super janky, oversized knife-resembling object on this piece of high-carbon steel. I managed to kind of sort of cut it out. It's very quick work, I will say that. Looks like crap, but I think if you used a very carefully constructed jig or template, you could use the tip guide and get a better cut than me. Now you can knock the dross off with a hammer, which defeats some of the time-saving purpose of this whole exercise, but you'd still need to head over to the grinder and get rid of that margin of bad steel, dross, beveling, messy cuts, all that stuff's got to go. I don't care how accurate you are with this thing, it's nowhere near in the same ballpark as the accuracy of a CNC-driven water jet or laser cutter, and it's going to create a much bigger overheated zone. And if you have a little screw up, like this, you'd probably have to scrap the part.
So, returning to my original question, is this going to be something that's useful for knife makers? For most of us, I doubt it. It's just too inaccurate. You lose too much material. That said, I genuinely was able to cut with this, and it cuts really quickly, and I'd still have eliminated a lot of grinding by doing it this way. And if I could have done it a little more accurately, which some planning and practice might give you, you actually might, well, you get the point. That's a lot of mights. So look, you know, in the whole world of knife makers, is there anybody who's going to benefit from the Vevor plasma cutter? Probably so. If you're a hobbyist, you know, who's also into metal fab or sculpture even, auto repair, these kind of things, you know, where you might be cutting large pieces of stuff that you don't need super accurate, or you're cutting large things apart, like, you know, cutting apart an old car. If you want something, you know, cut out of large sheets, all of these things are, you know, good uses for a plasma cutter. This thing does cut, and it is cheap. So, you know, for hobbyists, it might be really good. Maybe you don't have the money to buy a more professional model. I mean, what can I say? Yeah, it cuts. It's cheap. So...
Thanks for watching, guys. If you like what we're doing here, please subscribe and make sure that you click on that bell so you get notified of all the latest videos. Want to buy a knife from me? Check out my modern blades at tacticsarmory.com. Digging the channel? You can support our video making efforts on Patreon. You know, I've been banging away on these videos for like 10 years, so I hope you'll show some love for all that hard work. Link in the cards and descriptions. Finally, if you're interested in making Japanese swords, check out my full line of Japanese sword videos where I show how to forge Japanese swords as well as how to polish them and how to make fittings, handles, and scabbards. WalterSorrellsBlades.com.